How self-hate is sustained. The ability most of us have to observe ourselves obviously can be most useful in the proper context. It can be a precursor to constructive criticism and to real growth, but it also contributes to a splitting of self or a kind of self-consciousness, which inevitably makes for at least some loss of spontaneity. This loss of spontaneity makes us that much more dependent on self-hate as a stimulus and guide in living. Let me explain. There is a part of ourselves that, from childhood on, continues in the role of observer, evaluator, and censor too. Unfortunately, what starts out as benevolent self-protection often, especially in all too common adverse circumstances, turns to tyrannical despotism. Standards begin to be imposed which cannot be met. Examinations are constructed which cannot be passed. Self-consciousness and observation turn to self-contempt and to an underlying, ever-pervasive sense of self-defeat. Spontaneity and free behavior become confused with impulsivity and foolishness. In an effort to be safe from punitive aspects of the split-off hater of self, the victim becomes increasingly constricted and circumspect about behavior, feelings, and even thinking. More and more he turns, as so many prisoners do with their jailers, to the tyrant in himself for direction and for a substitute sense of aliveness. This results in further loss of self-truth, a further sense of weakening in self, and a further dependence on fixed and rigid rules and modes of behavior set down by the split-off, self-hating part of himself. There is then less and less practice and use of alive spontaneity in tapping one's real feelings, real thoughts, real assets, and real possibilities. Without any conscious awareness on the part of the victim, the tyrant has taken over, and, for the most part, a self has been lost. Any small awakening of self, any threat of resurrection usually brings fast action on the part of the tyrannical side to prevent conflict and possible victory of one's compassionate self. This usually takes the form of depression, which to me is often a signal that an individual still has hope and yearning to become alive and is feeling the beginnings of a constructive struggle. Without this yearning for a resurrection of spontaneity, we usually see abject, chronic resignation from the possibility of really feeling alive, rather than just depression, a true withdrawal from life. Depression is not only a result of the inner punishment we inflict on ourselves for daring to think of inner freedom, it is also the result of despair born of the inner knowledge of disloyalty to self and waste of one's self and one's real assets over a lifetime of capitulation to inner tyranny. Fortunately, as I shall explain when I discuss compassion, if the battle is engaged and sustained, spontaneity often wins out, because the great proclivity of most human beings is toward healthy growth, in the service of taking ourselves, our needs, our assets, and our real hopes and desires seriously. Unfortunately, this is often not evidenced because we suffer from the pressures of an impossible cultural value system of which both we and our parents are victims. The combination of inner and outer pressures makes extrication from this vice extremely painful and difficult, and requires considerable motivation. But now, what about particularly destructive parents? Let me first say that most of us are the victims of victims and continue to victimize unless real awareness, deep insight, and constructive struggle do otherwise intervene. Most people simply have no idea that they feed and help sustain the self-hating dynamism and also make contributions from it to their children, as well as to an ongoing cultural morass. Parents who, through their own difficulties, have lost spontaneity and behave in an anxiety-ridden, constricted pattern will, of course, transmit many of their self-hating postures to their children. Parents who, in one or another way, reject the child or any aspect of him or of his natural proclivities are often, without awareness, engaging in the process of hating the actual child and are producing fertile soil for growth of self-hate. Again, it must be remembered that due to our great and prolonged dependence on parents during childhood, we are particularly affected by how they feel about us. The very young child whose personality, his feelings about himself and himself relative to the world, and character structure, modes of behavior and relating to self and other people, are not yet formed, largely learns from his parents how to feel about himself. He automatically, without conscious awareness, applies how they feel about him to how he feels about himself. If they are grossly over-permissive and don't seem to care about him, then he feels he is a person not worth caring about. If they are overbearing and stifling, he sees himself as a fragile, vulnerable fragment of a person rather than as a separate, whole, capable human being. If they are excessively punitive, overbearing, or worse, sadistic, he sees himself as a monstrous person who must not trust ordinary human characteristics and impulses, let alone individual differences in his own judgment. If they have little respect or regard for the person he really is, for his natural proclivities, desires, goals, and talents, then he too will wish to be other than who he is. These parents may minimize his considerable and quite real assets while they extol the virtues of a mythical Superman. This, plus pressure from an enveloping culture, replete with impossible standards, exaggerated notions, and confusions as regards the human condition, will push the child into a self-idealizing process. He will aim for impossible goals of excess virtue, great power, ideal wisdom, all necessarily fraught with failure, frustration, and hopelessness. These are followed by still more self-hate, used as punishment for failure and as a goad to whip him on to further journeys away from his actual self and human possibilities and satisfactions. Parents who are overly jealous and excessively stringent in meting out punishment and in establishing prohibitions produce overwhelming, castigating consciences in their children. Criminals, I believe, suffer from the most tyrannical consciences, which means that in order to survive with some feeling left intact and alive, they must totally rebel and deaden their menacing consciences. Over-permissiveness, on the other hand, does not preclude a parent being a despot while seeming detached. It is possible to suffer almost complete combinations of destructive influences from a single parent, as well as from a combination of both parents and some cultural contributions. A single parent may herself suffer from considerable self-hate and active residuals of destructive pressures. The same parent may also contribute a large measure of compassion. This may seem incongruous and inconsistent, and indeed it is, but it is also characteristic of the human condition. We, each of us, are subject to both constructive and destructive elements in our development, and in most cases we contain a plenitude of all possible elements. In any case, the question of ratio and degree are obviously of prime importance. A stringent culture combined with inconsistently destructive parents who themselves contain little or no active compassion will produce children who will be messes of self-hate. Fortunately, this is rarely the case, and with most of us, at least some compassionate influence has been transmitted. Once the self-hating process has been set in motion, it becomes firmly entrenched and develops an autonomy of its own. It comes to be felt as more than just familiar. It is felt as the central core of one's identification. One sees oneself relative to self-hating values and ideas. Eventually, any feeling or idea about oneself that springs from whatever healthy self-esteem has managed to remain alive is felt as alien and threatening, and poses a threat to a process which, like all totalitarian processes, requires total subjection and compliance for survival. Therefore, any feelings of real self-esteem or any contribution to real self-esteem are quickly repressed. Sometimes certain shots in the arm, such as momentary stimulation through sexual escapades, a good business deal, a windfall, going on a trip, are seen and felt as self-esteem, but they are frequently used to feed pride and grandiosity, and they represent further excursions away from actual self. Karen Horney described this process brilliantly in her work, and I'll have more to say about this later. To close this chapter, let me describe a patient I treated for several years. Bill was the only son of immigrant parents who were both profoundly insecure people, preoccupied with the idea of fitting into this culture and country by always doing the right thing. They saw their son as the perfect child, through whom the fact of their non-American births would be completely erased. From the earliest age, Bill repeatedly demonstrated a considerable gift and desire to draw and paint. His parents' initial praise turned to discouragement and then to ridicule, and finally to vindictive tirades by the time he was a teenager. They felt that artwork was foreign, frivolous, feminine, and the antithesis of whatever goals they could accept for Bill. Bill's initial attempts at self-assertion and even rebellion soon turned to complete capitulation and compliance. This was largely due to his being beaten and locked in the closet, and on several occasions when he vented his anger, having his mouth washed with strong soap. Bill says he became a good boy and a nearly perfect student in school. He also said that he distinctly remembered a day when he was 15 when he, quote, felt something die in me, and I got into a kind of peaceful fog that I stayed in until now. This feeling, he recalled, occurred when he came home from school and told his parents that a teacher told him that he ought to consider transferring to the High School of Music and Art. Terrible recriminations and hysteria followed this announcement. Throughout his childhood, Bill remembered his parents as being overprotective and tyrannical. He was constantly taken to doctors for all kinds of ills imagined by his mother. He was seldom permitted to participate in activities with other boys and could not have friends who did not dress and speak in a proper manner. He doesn't remember ever being allowed to sleep over at anybody else's house or to go off on a trip with friends. He recalls his mother showing him off to neighbors as being absolutely neat and clean and showing them his almost perfect report cards. But this was always done out of his cognizance. Indeed, he only heard about these comments through the neighbors themselves. His parents never praised him, and at most only grudgingly approved of behavior they condoned, obviously feeling that marked enthusiasm would be a signal to him to let up on his efforts. Quote, I felt that nothing I did was ever good enough, and that I had to do better than anyone else I knew just to get by. He remembers his parents also frequently telling him not to think you're too good and to aim for a good, regular job that you can count on because the world is really a jungle. Though teachers encouraged him to go to college and he had the second highest average in high school, his parents insisted he take no chances in getting started earning. College sounded frivolous to them. This meant taking a job as an assistant furniture designer in a well-known firm. He took the job, lived at home, socialized very infrequently, and 20 years later, at the age of 36, became severely depressed. Once again, his mother intervened. She and Bill's boss consulted a local doctor who advised electroshock treatment. By this time, Bill was designing 90% of the firm's furniture, but was still called an assistant designer. He received 10% more than he had started with in salary and also parked the boss's car and chauffeured the boss and his parents around in his spare time. Up to the time of his depression, he incredibly had no feeling of exploitation and, as he put it later, I wonder if I had any feeling at all. But he was extremely useful, and it was decided that ECT would get him back to full production faster than any other means. However, after 2 shock treatments, Bill suddenly asserted himself and refused to have any more, deciding on his own to see a therapist. When he came to me, he was severely depressed and agitated. Many early sessions were spent recounting countless events depicting tyranny, exploitation, and choking off of any hope or aspiration. Quote, I was a good boy and almost a complete emotional vegetable. Bill amply demonstrated the results of parental and cultural exaggerated pressures to conform, to make it, to be good, etc. He demonstrated massive self-hate on both direct and indirect kinds. His concept of himself, his actual self, could hardly be worse, yet there were all kinds of goals of purity he felt compelled to fulfill. He saw himself as the selfless martyr par excellence, and his parents and boss helped feed this image. He was also a mass of rage and initially had no idea that he was angry at all. He feared anger terribly, equating it with madness and being evil. Thus, his anger at other people had been completely repressed out of awareness. Much of it had also been internalized, turned against himself, and took the form of chronic depression, resignation, and deadening of feelings. Surrender to both inner and outer tyranny, the desire to give up the fight for self, which is the epitome of self-hate, was represented by the feeling that, quote, something had died in me. How did Bill become acutely depressed, and what did his depression represent? How did chronic depression and years of smoldering rage become mobilized into severe, acute depression, which is too painful to be ignored? For countless people, this never happens. Their actual selves have been reduced to ashes, and no flame can be fanned up from embers that are all too dead. In these people, self-hate has triumphed completely. For many people, chronic depression, inner emptiness, and deadness have become a way of life, and they no longer know that alternatives exist. Indeed, they don't even know that they are depressed. I suspect that one of the big factors in Bill's life was his work. He was fortunate to get a job in furniture design, quite by chance, and fortunately his parents did not equate this work with artistic endeavor. While this work didn't begin to tap what eventually turned out to be a storehouse of considerable talent, it did give Bill some personal satisfaction and did keep a small part of himself alive and yearning. Several months after treatment began, when much of his rage had been vented, he realized he wasn't crazy after all, and his acute depression and agitation had abated. He told me something that he considered a deep and frightening secret. He was only able to tell me this because he trusted my interest and involvement in helping to bring his actual self into fruition, and knew that I wouldn't castigate him. But when he told me, and this was at age 37, he was still quite obviously tremulous and fearful. The secret? That he locked himself up in his room periodically and painted a small picture. So he did manage to stay alive until a time came when two important events occurred. A wealthy businessman who manufactured furniture and who realized that Bill, without any of his own awareness, had become one of the most important designers in the business, offered to put Bill into business on his own. A new employee of Bill's firm fell in love with him, insisted on an affair and marriage, and encouraged him to get into business and to paint. He finally showed her one painting, and she insisted that he spend more and more time painting, and set up part of her own apartment as a studio in order for him to be able to do this. Bill's parents knew nothing of the painting, but thought the idea of his own business, and the girl too, were evidence of some kind of insanity which suddenly had taken over their son. The pressure on Bill, both externally and internally, became intense. From the bottom of years of being pushed down almost into nothingness, his actual self fought its way up into awareness. Its yearnings for human satisfaction could no longer be ignored. Bill wanted the girl, the business, to paint, and to live. His self-hating side wanted him to go on quietly, to take no risks, to continue in a stunted existence, and to sustain illusions of mythical grandeur through fantasies of glorious martyrdom and devotion to marvelous parents. Severe acute depression was punishment for guilt felt for betrayal of the imaginary image and its rules, including the yearning for human satisfactions that brought with it the possibility of being a bad son. He inflicted this punishment on himself in an attempt to whip himself back into his former position. It was also an attempt to anesthetize, deaden, and to put down and away the entire conflict. But it also represented very real sorrow stemming from newborn awareness that years of good living potential had been wasted. Bill initially raged at himself and was full of blatant and direct self-hate. He saw himself as a monstrous ingrate and as the equivalent of a parent killer. This was followed by recounting years of self-neglect and various forms of indirect self-hate, which I describe in a later chapter. This includes many delusions about his purity, sweetness, devotion, etc. He had no idea that his description was of an archangel and had little or nothing to do with the human condition. But actual self, once heard from, really heard from, is not easily put down. Bill's choice of psychoanalysis over electric shock treatment was crucial. In this choice, he made the most important decision of his life. He had, in fact, decided to embark on a tough journey in search of himself, rather than to execute himself by severe self-punishment and to resign once and for all. Bill's treatment included much exploration, reevaluation, education, and painful struggle on his part. He came to realize how much of his confused feelings and thinking were part of an impossible cultural value system of which his parents were also victims. Self-hate was largely defeated in favor of compassion. Initial hatred for his parents turned to compassion, and he eventually came to have a fairly mature, realistic relationship with them. Bill went into business and is currently very successful. His paintings have received considerable recognition and are now usually very large canvases. Bill is happily married and has 2 children of his own, one of whom already demonstrates much talent in painting and receives plenty of parental encouragement. Bill did not marry the girl who initially encouraged him, however. He felt that she was too much like his mother.